Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I'm Alex Pollock of the R Street Institute, and Paul Kupiec, who has organized this book event, and I are delighted that you have joined us for our discussion of Sebastian Mallaby's The Man Who Knew, The Life and Times of Alan Greenspan. This book, let me hasten to mention, if you didn't notice, the book is on sale outside. We encourage you to buy a copy or two. And after our panel, we're going to have a reception during which Sebastian will be happy to autograph copies of the book. In my view, this book is very interesting and also very enjoyable read. By way of introduction, I'll quote a few striking phrases from it. As Sebastian describes in detail throughout this compendium of biography, ideas, politics, economics, strong personalities, and a lot of good gossip, Alan Greenspan is a highly interesting and highly complex mind, character, and political actor. As Sebastian writes, quote, a sort of manipulative genius. That's my first striking phrase. There is in this book a morality play of Alan Greenspan's 50-year climb to world fame. A quote, a life trajectory angled upward at the steepest possible incline, in Greenspan's own words to the author. This climb included, quote, the emerging bubble in Greenspan's own status, as Sebastian says, also calling this, quote, cult status. Now, the status bubble, as we know, inflated all the way to the honorific the maestro. And then, as all bubbles do, the bubble burst and shriveled, and there followed a fall from adulation and grace. Was that fall fair, I ask? For how much of that fall from maestro status was Greenspan himself, and how much was simply the correction of a foolish public or media expectation? In my view, it was the adulatory expectations which were foolish. The notion that anyone could be such an alleged maestro in a world subject to such uncertainties and lack of knowledge was evidently misguided. Reflecting on this, Sebastian sensibly concludes, quote, systems of public administration that presume the existence of omniscient saviors will inevitably fail. Very true. Because, as he rightly tells us, we need, quote, to understand decision-making as it really is, imperfect, improvised, contingent upon incomplete information, and flawed human nature. Indeed, so it is, especially, I would add, the flawed human nature part. And the book helps us see this reality. Sebastian's going to present his book in about 25 minutes. Our discussants will follow for 10 minutes each. We'll give the panel a chance to exchange views, then open the floor to your questions. We'll adjourn at 6:25 for the panel, but don't go away because there's a surprise at that point. And at this point, it is a pleasure to introduce our author, Sebastian Mallaby, who is the Paul A. Volcker Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a contributing columnist for the Washington Post, where he previously was a member of the editorial board and has been a contributing editor of the Financial Times. The book we're about to discuss, The Man Who Knew, was released last October following 5 years of research. Sebastian is also the author of More Money Than God, Hedge Funds and the Making of a New Elite, a New York Times bestseller, The World's Banker, a portrait of the World Bank, and After Apartheid, and he's a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. We're delighted to have him here to present his book, And after that, I will introduce our distinguished discussants. Sebastian, welcome to the AEI podium.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that introduction, Alex. It's very nice when the person introducing has really not only read the book, but also thought about the book and, and digested it and then says he enjoys it. That's the perfect trifecta, so thank you very much. As Alex mentioned briefly, it wasn't my first book. In my 20s, I was the Economist correspondent in Africa, and I was standing outside Nelson Mandela's jail when Mandela came out, and I thought my career would be downhill from thereafter because nothing could be as exciting as watching Mandela come out of jail. So I wrote a quick book called After Apartheid. It took 3 months. In my 30s, I did that book about the World Bank. That took not 3 months, but a year and 3 months. In my 40s, I wrote a book about hedge funds, a history of the wild west of investing. This took 4 years. You're noticing a trend. And now I'm 52 years old. I'm in front of you, and I've done this book. It took me more than 5 years. And my children, who are not always kind to me, say, "This is not a sustainable trend, Dad. Come on. Longer every time. Why do you take so long?" And so I thought I'd begin by just explaining a little bit to you why I was drawn to this project, why I thought it was worth that amount of intellectual energy. And then I'll get to some policy takeaways, which I hope we can discuss and maybe even disagree on in a minute. So the first reason to spend this amount of time on a biography of Alan Greenspan is that I think pretty clearly he is the preeminent post-war financial statesman. And if we think about other big names in post-war financial statecraft, you might mention Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Fed for 8 years in a critical period, or Paul Volcker, also 8 years at a different critical period when inflation began in double digits. So these people have, of course, a claim to the history books, but Alan Greenspan, not 8 years at the top of the Fed, but 18 and a half. And if you add to that his period as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Ford White House, you get 21 years at the top. So I think partly just by dint of that longevity in office and adding together a lot of things he did when out of office, but around power, advising Nixon, advising Reagan, chairing the so-called Greenspan Commission on the future of Social Security, you've basically got 4 decades when he's in or around the center of power. And this is the period when modern finance was created. So when Greenspan signed on with Nixon in 1967 on the campaign, there were no financial derivatives. There were interest rates that were capped by Regulation Q. There were, currency that couldn't fluctuate because the dollar was pegged to gold. And so you had little of the freewheeling finance that we've come to recognize later. That's at the start of Greenspan's public life. And then, of course, at the end of his life, end of his public life, he retires from the Fed in 2006 on the eve of the great crash. So the arc of his public life maps perfectly onto the making of modern finance. And to me, that was a narrative challenge, which enabled you to get inside the car driving across the landscape of the making of modern finance and watch the driver and see, why did he go left here? Why did he go right there? Because we didn't create a financial system that blew up because the people who did it were dumb or immoral or not thoughtful. I mean, clearly, none of those things are really true. There were thoughtful people wrestling earnestly with difficult decisions, and yet they created a system that proved very fragile. So that was the first thing that drew me to this project. Another thing, as Alex said, his reputation went from maestro to villain, from hero to zero. I think it's the fastest reappraisal of anybody in public life that I can think of. And I wanted to sort of think about where the right level ought to be. When I'm forced to put a number on this, I say 8 out of 10. He had a long public life. He made one big mistake towards the end. But really, his record up to then was remarkably good. And I'll get to maybe why I think that. But we can debate that. But I put a number out there, 8 out of 10, for you guys to react to. The other thing is, number 3, when I began this book, I didn't realize quite what I was getting into and how fascinating and interesting it was going to be. I thought I was writing the biography of this preeminent post-war financial statesman. I didn't realize I was writing the biography of this mesmerizing Machiavellian political operator. But when I began to discover the political side of Alan Greenspan, I course corrected, and it just became a fascinating thing that drew me in further and further. So, one vignette is that in my research, of course, I went to see everybody who interacted with him that I could kind of think of, and one such person was Pat Buchanan, who was instrumental in the Nixon campaign alongside Greenspan, and was actually a bit of an ally of Greenspan's in that campaign. So I went to see Pat to see if I could get some interesting color, interesting stories, interesting memories. And it went beyond that because he took me down to his basement where there are two main things. A very good collection of antique firearms and a very good collection of the memos written to Nixon during that campaign, 67-68, including Greenspan's memos. And what you see when you read that selection of memos is Greenspan going from sort of straight economic advice to being the person who analyzed the polls for Nixon. So he would take regional polls, and because Greenspan was an economic consultant whose company owned a mainframe computer, he fed these regional polling results into his computer to analyze, which message calibration in which region of the country would work out best for the candidate. So he went from economic advice to polling advice, and by the end it was straight spin. I mean, it was, Mr. Nixon, you think the following, but I would advise you to downplay that when speaking in the South and to emphasize something different over here. And so essentially he became a kind of political campaign advisor. And this was the beginning of his political education. And it went a lot further than that. In the Nixon, during the Nixon administration, he got into really a remarkable story about subjugating the Federal Reserve. Greenspan was not in office, but he was an out-of-office ally of the Nixon team, and he helped to persuade the Fed to cut interest rates before the 1972 election. Going forward, Greenspan joined the Ford White House, and he fought bureaucratic battles with Henry Kissinger, and he won, right? Kissinger's supposed to be the masterful bureaucratic infighter, but there are wonderful transcripts of Kissinger's conversations with his deputy or phone calls. The 70s is the period when people had invented the recording device, whether it was the tape recorder or the photocopier. They hadn't figured out yet that it was dangerous. So for a historian, this is great news. And I could read, exactly what Kissinger was saying to his colleagues and deputies in the State Department because, it was all transcribed. And so at one point, the New York Times ran a story to the effect of, Kissinger meddles in policy he doesn't understand, because Kissinger was getting involved in an international economic issue. And so Kissinger was absolutely furious about this attack on his understanding, and he turned around to his deputy and said, "Where did this come from?" And the deputy said, "Well, I think Alan Greenspan planted that story." And Kissinger kind of, okay, So this was the level of Greenspan's political adeptness and his willingness to play politics, and I'll come back to that and what it means for his tenure as Fed chairman. So that was one surprise, the political side of Alan Greenspan. There was a personal surprise too. I mean, just briefly, I know this is a very august audience of think tank, policy-focused people, so I'm not going to dwell on the gossip too much. But just to say that, you may remember the pinstripe-suited Fed chairman talking earnestly about trucking capacity utilization in the Midwest. But he was also the guy who in his 30s bought the wonderful convertible Buick, the Buick Electra 225, with red leather seats on the inside, enormous amounts of chrome on the outside, massive tail fins. And he would drive this wonderful car down the streets of Manhattan that one of his former girlfriends told me was not what modern central bankers would call a moderate pace. So he would get speeding ticket after speeding ticket, but he was earning plenty of money, so that was fine. Greenspan was not against marriage. He did it twice. But he was single between the age of 27 and 71, which I think you'll agree is an eccentric formula. So I don't want to dwell on the personal stuff. I know you guys hate gossip and all that, but just to say that there was a personal dimension to the story, which was more fascinating than I expected going in. Most amazing of all was Greenspan's intellectual development. One story that brought this home to me was that I'd known from friends of mine who were investigative reporters at the Wall Street Journal that when Greenspan became chairman, they tried to get his PhD thesis, which was awarded by NYU. So they went to NYU library and they said, hand over. And the library said, sorry, we lost it. and nobody ever knew whether it was really lost or kind of lost. Who knows? But anyway, nobody had ever found it. And I would go visit Alan during the process of this research. I'd sit at the round table in the alcove of his office, which I'm sure some of you here have also sat at for lunch. And we'd have these long conversations every couple of weeks, go on for a couple of hours. For me, it was research. For him, it was probably therapy. No, he was being very kind and sharing his time. And I noticed that when he mentioned his early writing and thinking, his eyes would sort of do this. I think this is what interrogators call the tell, some kind of physical behavior that gives something away. And so I looked up there too at the shelf, and there was this fat PhD-sized binder. So I said, "Oh, Alan, it would be nice if I could have a copy of your PhD." And he gave it to me. But when I read it, the point here is that the central paper in this PhD essentially argues that the Fed has as its key mission the responsibility to fight bubbles. Fight bubbles. I mean, you couldn't make this irony up, given that he is the person who was laid low by a bubble later on. He had warned against precisely this danger early on. So that got me thinking. Then I knew that he'd been very close to Ayn Rand in the 1960s. I knew that he'd given speeches under the auspices of Ayn Rand, but nobody seemed to have a copy of these speeches. They must have existed somewhere, I thought, because Ayn Rand was a notorious control freak. You couldn't give a speech in her name without first having her check it. So, I kept asking people, I called up various Ayn Rand institutes. Nobody seemed to have it. And then one day I went to interview the former computer operator in Greenspan Associates, Townsend Greenspan Associates, the Greenspan consulting company. And I thought, well, this person worked for many years in a fairly lowly position for Alan Greenspan, but, he'll have a good sense of the company, the culture, and, I ought to go see him. So I drove 2 hours out of Washington to a place in Virginia, a kind of clearing in the woods, as I recall, a cabin by itself, and I spoke to Lowell Wiltbank, who is the person I'm talking about. And remarkably, it turned out that he too was a close follower of Ayn Rand, but he was a very well-organized follower of Ayn Rand with a terrific basement. This is what historians like. They like basements. Basements with memos and documents in them. And I said, do you have any documents from the 1960s pertaining to Ayn Rand? He said, of course I have. Do you have Greenspan's speeches that he gave in around 63, 64? Of course I have. Could I have a copy? I guess. So he made me a photocopy very kindly, and he gave it to me. And when I read this 300-page transcript called collectively The Economics of a Free Society, given at the time when Barry Goldwater's campaign was beginning to take off, and Alan was explaining to the Ayn Rand followers that Goldwater's okay, you should support Goldwater, although he is a bit liberal. Greenspan said in these speeches, he said, the creation of the Federal Reserve was an historic disaster. You couldn't make it up. I mean, the man who personified the Fed, who embodied the Fed, had said that its creation was a mistake. So this was obviously incredibly intriguing. You could have debates about the nature of the monetary system, the gold standard versus fiat currency, and you didn't need to go outside Greenspan's head, right? He'd had both of those. He embodied fiat currency and he had advocated for the gold standard. He'd done both at different times. And so that in itself was intellectually fascinating, but there was a serious point to it as well. And this is the first kind of policy point I want to get to, which is to say that I think it's a fair, slightly crude, but roughly fair caricature of some of the popular reactions to 2008 to say that there was a line of commentary that said we had a crisis because a naive believer in the self-policing efficiency of markets was in control. And this naive believer, Alan Greenspan, didn't bother to regulate finance, didn't bother to limit leverage, didn't bother to care about it, because he thought there wouldn't be a bubble because guess what? Markets are efficient. Now, that is so far from the truth that anybody who thinks that needs to rip up that thesis and start getting a new one fast. And the early writings of Greenspan that I discovered underline that point, right? This is a person who in the 50s was writing that the central mission of the Fed was to fight bubbles. This was a person who was so worried about excess money printing that he advocated a gold standard and didn't think there should be a central bank. This was a person then, in other things he wrote, client letters, speeches he gave, and so forth, was extremely preoccupied by market overshoots. the irony is that if you think about the so-called new economics, the kind of revisionist of economic assumptions that happened after 2008, look at George Soros's Institute for New Economic Thinking. A lot of the ideas pushed by that crowd are ideas that Greenspan was fully comfortable with way before the crisis. The notion that in a kind of Hyman-Minsky way, certainty begets more risk, which begets more uncertainty. I mean, he would say that at the FOMC, words to that effect, repeatedly. So Greenspan understood the fragility of finance. He understood that the system could break down. He was, as my title says, the man who knew. Yet he was not the man who acted. He did not prevent the crisis. Why is that? You have to think afresh. It can't be an intellectual failing. It's not an analytical failing. I think instead it's a political failing. It's a failure of the political system which basically made it very difficult for the Fed to act on regulation, to limit leverage. And in my story of the 2000s, I describe how the Fed tried more than people realize on subprime mortgages. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, you can get the transcript of Greenspan talking to Ned Gramlich about what to do with subprime mortgages and the fact that the selling practices were dangerous and the people borrowing these things probably couldn't pay back. And they were excoriated later on, after 2008, for not adopting a new rule to limit mis-selling. Guess what? They did adopt a rule to limit mis-selling. And the staff estimated that something like 1/3 of the most dangerous subprime mortgages would be prevented by virtue of this new regulation. But it didn't work because A, it's always easy to tweak financial products to get around the rules, so regulation is tough to make stick for that reason. And B, the supervision that needed to happen to enforce the rule was parceled out in the alphabet soup of different federal agencies, not all of which are terribly effectively staffed. So I think in the case of non-bank mortgage origination, for example, it's the FTC that is supposed to go look. Now, I think I'm right in saying that the FTC has a number of supervisors that is fairly easy to remember. 0. Because the FTC is an enforcement agency and waits for complaints to be brought. It doesn't proactively supervise in the way that the Fed would do with a bank. So these are the kinds of reasons why regulation failed to prevent excess leverage. And that leads me to the view that if regulation is tough to make stick, then you have to be willing to consider the use of interest rates. When you see bubbles emerging, not all the time, not when the real economy is operating way below potential and so forth, but if the economy is at potential, but inflation is quiescent, the inflation targeting mindset that says, well, gee, that's okay, we're fine on the inflation target, so we don't need to raise rates. No, you should raise rates. If you think employment is roughly full, the fact that inflation is stable is not a reason to sit there and do nothing. Because I think 1999 shows what happens when you do that. You get an enormous bubble in tech stocks. 2004, 2005 shows what happens when you do that. You get an enormous bubble in subprime. I know that there's a literature that says, you'd have to raise short-term interest rates by a massive amount in order to have any effect on a bubble. I don't believe that modeling can demonstrate that because it's a combination of raising the short rate and communicating your intention to fight a bubble. Sometimes there are moments when the Fed communicates an intention to raise rates in the future, like think of the taper tantrum in 2013. The mere communication without any actual interest rate change caused markets to sell off radically. So you can have an enormous effect on bubbles with 0 changes in interest rates in some states of the world. So the kind of confident assertion, which I hear from some central bankers, some ex-central bankers, that listen, Sebastian, forget the interest rates, forget using interest rates to fight bubbles, you'd have to raise them by like 5-6 percentage points. That is not a proven thesis, I'm sorry. I mean, the opposite isn't proven either. I can't show you for sure that raising interest rates would work to fight a bubble, but I'm convinced that we don't know the opposite to be the case. And I think we should be open to using interest rates. I think my view is the moderate and kind of humble one, right? I'm saying, I don't think regulation will necessarily work. Fine, try it. By all means, try macroprudential stuff. But don't be too confident that that will work. So hold open the possibility that you will use interest rates as well. I think the radical and slightly arrogant view is, oh, we've got it covered. We've got macroprudential. It's going to be fine. don't even think about interest rates, which is how I would interpret the consensus as it is today. So I argue from history that the consensus about future bubbles is dangerous and misguided. And I also argue from history that the key to understanding risks around bubbles is essentially these political factors. To what extent are technocrats, central bankers, constrained from acting by either direct political pressure or by a sort of consensus that favors inflation targeting and then takes away the feeling of the ability to act on a bubble. Alex, can I make one more point, or am I out of time? One more point.
One more point would be perfect.
One more point, all right. So this is a point about Fed independence, which I think is going to be relevant perhaps in the next year or so. As the Fed was already poised to hike rates before November, as President Trump talks about adding fiscal stimulus to the equation, as he talks about trade measures that may disrupt supply and thereby increase pressure on prices. Of course, he may do deregulation, which would be good for supply and reduce pressure on prices. But net-net, I think of Trump as a inflationary president, and I think that's what the markets are signaling as well. So the Fed was already going to tighten. It will probably tighten faster because of the Trump White House. That means that tightening implies a stronger dollar, and a stronger dollar is not good for manufacturing workers in Wisconsin and in the upper Midwest, and President Trump is not going to like that. And I believe he will come after the Fed in a way that we haven't experienced for 25 years. We haven't seen the executive branch go after the independent Fed for a quarter of a century in a way that I think is quite likely to happen in the future. How should the Fed defend itself against that potential attack? I think you have to look back at the last time the Fed had to defend itself against this sort of attack. And that time is when Alan Greenspan squared off against the team in the George H.W. Bush White House. The George H.W. Bush White House wanted cuts in interest rates and made that very clear. And Richard Darman, the budget director, would go around Washington saying things like, Alan Greenspan, 65 years old, calls his mother every day. Bit creepy? Does this remind you of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho? So there was an element of real nasty pressure on Greenspan and on the Fed, and Greenspan withstood that. How did he withstand it? Not by saying, I'm a technocrat, I'm in my ivory tower, I'm ignoring politics. The way he dealt with political pressure is that when he was punched on the nose, he punched people back. He understood power, and he knew how to wield it. I said earlier on that my discovery of the Greenspan political side from the 70s and the 60s, that's not just of historical interest, that is of future relevance, because it was those political skills learned with Nixon and learned in the Ford administration that enabled Greenspan to hit back when the Fed was under pressure in the early 1990s. I believe Greenspan created Fed independence by beating the Bush administration in a straight-out political war, and I document that in my book. And I think that's something that Janet Yellen and current central bankers need to look at. They need to think about the last time a central bank successfully resisted political pressure, and you don't do it just by being nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian. Those of us who might get 3 out of 10, or perhaps with a really sympathetic judge, 3.2, are really impressed with your 8 out of 10 score for Chairman Greenspan. And you didn't mention, but since it's AEI, I should mention his concern with bubbles, as you point out, because the famous irrational exuberance speech was given at AEI, as you discuss in the book. All right, let's turn to our discussants. First, we'll have Al Broadus. Al was president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond from 1993 to 2004, and this was, of course, during the Federal Reserve chairmanship of Alan Greenspan. Al served as a member of the Open Market Committee during this period. He had joined the Richmond Fed's research staff as an economist in 1970 and become director of research in 1985. So he has long and deep experience in the Federal Reserve. Al is a member of the board of the Virginia Council on Economic Education, the Advisory Council of the School of Business of the University of Richmond, the Executive Committee of Richmond Renaissance, and numerous other boards, and we're honored to have him here with his perspective this evening. Our second discussant will be Paul Kupiec, also, as I mentioned, the organizer of this event. Paul is a resident scholar at AEI, where he studies the management and regulation of banks and financial markets. I would say with very healthy skepticism toward macroprudential regulation, Sebastian. Paul's studies include systemic risk and the impact of financial regulations on the economy. He was previously director of the Center for Financial Research at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, served as chairman of the research task force of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. He worked for the International Monetary Fund, Freddie Mac, and J.P. Morgan, and was on the Federal Reserve Board staff during Alan Greenspan's chairmanship, where he worked on projects directly for the chairman. Al, we'll start with you. I'm looking forward to your comments. Oh.
Maybe I'll just stay here. How about that? So
You are allowed to be where you like.
I knocked this thing over at the last. This is probably my last meeting here. Since that's fun, why don't I just stay here? I guess
That's
it's just as simple. And it's a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed your comments, Sebastian, very much. Certainly enjoyed the book. I've got 10 minutes now, so I've kind of written out a text here. Let me just go through that, and then I look forward to Paul's comments, and we can have some discussion, because I think some of the things you said were very, very intriguing. When I retired from the Fed back in mid-2004, I set some goals for what I would do with the additional time I expected to have after retiring. One thing I knew I wanted to do was to read some classic books that I had not yet gotten to, in particular Moby Dick and Crime and Punishment. So I did that, and those books, of course, are challenging. So after finishing the latter, Crime and Punishment, I decided I was going to take it easy on myself and find some easier reading, and more important, find a fun book. As soon as I get finished with this book about Alan Greenspan that I needed to read for this program. Not that I don't find Chairman Greenspan interesting. I've been around him a lot, and I certainly do. But I've read several books about him. I have read at least one of his own two memoirs. Recently read Ben Bernanke's book, read Tim Geithner's book. So I wasn't expecting to yet another book about Greenspan and the Fed to be a page-turner, or certainly a fun book. But it turns out that Sebastian's book is the fun book that I was looking for. But more than that, it's an important, substantive, and I think timely study, not only of Greenspan, but of some of the principal issues that both the Fed and other central banks had to deal with over the course of his long career. And looking forward, the book highlights a key issue that is raised by Sebastian's broader evaluation of Greenspan's Fed tenure that I think the Fed is already confronting and will have to continue to confront. You've already alluded to it in the years ahead, and I'll come back to that at the end of my brief comments. Sebastian's book is in just regular book forms. The text is almost 700 pages long. In addition, and this is important, there are footnotes, but these are not just citations. Some of them are even essays, I would say, and you definitely need to read those. So I think if they were printed in regular print, that would be another 200 pages. So we're talking about a book that is almost 1,000 pages long. So it's lengthy, and it offers a lot of options for a commenter.
I cut 200 pages just to spare you.
I'm glad you did, because it was tough getting through it all. So there are lots of things that I could talk about, but I've only got 10 minutes, and I'm going to try to stay to that. So I'll just try to do two things briefly. First, I'll comment quickly on the book's overall structure, and then I will identify as clearly as I can what I see as Sebastian's principal conclusion, which frames the key policy issue for the Fed and other central banks going forward that I alluded to a minute ago. So the book has three sections, broadly chronological, and Sebastian's already alluded to this a bit. The first describes how I would summarize it this way. It describes how Greenspan's boyhood as an only child with essentially a single parent, his mother, who was very, how that background shaped his ideological foundation as a young man, which featured, among other things, as I'm sure you all know, enthusiasm for self-reliant capitalism, a broadly laissez-faire attitude toward government intervention in the economy and regulation, and adherence to the gold standard as the best anchor for the monetary system. This section also, as you've mentioned, Sebastian, reviews his famous association with Ayn Rand and her circle of friends, where, as you pointed out, I didn't know this before, he was dubbed by her, I think, the Undertaker because of his relatively dour attire in that interesting group. But the book does a good job of summarizing the impact of this group and his association with it on Greenspan's thinking. The second section focuses on Greenspan's political career before the Fed, running from his role in the Nixon administration through his important roles in the Ford and Reagan years, up to his appointment as Fed chairman in 1987. And as you point out, this experience, this activity at very high levels in the political world forced him, I would say, and I think you say, to qualify, compromise, and in some cases actually abandon some of his foundational beliefs and behaviors. I watched Chairman Greenspan for many years at very close range, but at a sufficient distance so that at the time I really wished I'd had a better understanding of some of the influences and experiences that drove his behavior and his decisions during the time that I was close to him there in the Fed. I think the first two sections of this book do a great job of answering a lot of those questions, at least for me, and I think it will for other people interested in Greenspan and his career. Most importantly, though, these first two sections prepare the reader for Sebastian's detailed review and evaluation of Greenspan's Fed tenure, which comprises the third and I think in many ways most important section of the book. There's several themes here. For example, and you mentioned his experience with George H.W. Bush. I think in that instance and in others as well, you show how Greenspan's formidable intellect, along with his political experience and sensitivity, I think at the end of the day raised, at least in that period, the Fed stature and respect both within the government and beyond it, and strengthened, as you mentioned a minute ago, the Fed's independence. The main theme in this section, of this last section of the book, though, for me at least, is the evaluation of Greenspan's stewardship of monetary policy and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the stability of the financial system on the other. Now, let me say for clarity that when I say monetary, at least for the time being, you've opened up my thinking on this a bit. When I talk about monetary policy, I'm talking about the Fed's pursuit of its dual mandate of price stability and full employment, with, for me personally, the greatest weight appropriately being on price stability as it is conventionally defined. So against that background, I would summarize my takeaway from this section along the following lines. In the early 1980s, Paul Volcker broke the intense inflationary cycle that had developed in the 1970s and established the Fed's responsibility for achieving and maintaining price stability. Greenspan extended this progress and arguably achieved a workable approximation of price stability towards the mid to late 1990s. But attaining this objective came at a cost in 2003, and then the Fed's effort to preempt inflation after that, as its interest rate instrument target approached zero bound, stimulated through its actions the emerging housing bubble. And finally, the Fed further nourished, it's a little different from what I have in mind, is the principal tarnish on Greenspan's career, rather than, as you emphasized a minute ago, the ideologically induced failure to regulate financial markets and instruments that's so often emphasized by Greenspan's most vocal critics. Sebastian, I think, sees irony in this judgment, since in his view, Greenspan's consistent refusal to submit to an explicit numerical inflation target gave him plenty of room to resist financial bubbles more forcefully. And I think your conclusion is that if he had done so, we would have gotten a better outcome with maybe some sort of balance of financial stability, macro financial stability, and price stability. If this is a reasonably accurate summary of the book's main conclusion, what can I say about it that might be useful? Just a little background first on where I'm coming from. The main thing I learned, or maybe more accurately I should say, the main conviction I developed while working in the Fed in my years of attending FOMC meetings and also in my interactions with my staff at the Richmond Fed, some very good people, in particular Marvin, a good friend, who was my principal advisor in those years, now a distinguished professor at Carnegie Mellon. My main takeaway from that experience is that Fed monetary policy will most likely benefit the economy if it achieves and maintains price stability, again, as conventionally measured by something like the Core Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. And to get to price stability, the Fed's pursuit of it must be credible. And to be credible, the Fed must avoid distractions, such as, for example, foreign exchange market intervention that might give markets and the public the sense that the Fed is trying to target some particular level for the dollar. And to the main point in your book, I think, or certainly one of the main points, Sebastian, I would argue that I would be worried that trying to actively promote financial stability, popping bubbles, would risk being such a distraction. And that's what I've got to think about. Sebastian's conclusion, if I've got it right, is that Chairman Greenspan and the Fed should have given greater weight to financial stability while pursuing price stability. And that point of view challenges my conviction that I just described. This policy of view, of course, is not new, but the breadth and depth of the book and the research in it that led its author to this conclusion is impressive. It demands attention and some thought, and I'm trying to give it to it. I don't expect to abandon my support for the primacy of price stability, but as a result of reading this book, I'm asking myself, is it feasible to add a more explicit consideration, choose that word carefully, of financial stability to the Fed's policy objectives? And if so, how would you do it? How would you do it operationally? I don't know. Just a thought that comes to mind. Of course, the Fed operates now in pursuing its dual mandate of price stability and high employment, often using a Taylor rule, which has a couple of gaps. The price stability gap, you might call one, and the output gap is the other. Maybe we should add a third gap. There would be perhaps the gap between some actual real interest rate, maybe the real 10-year rate on the one hand, and some moving average of an estimate of the natural rate of interest. Maybe that would work. I don't know. In any event, your book is stimulating enough that I'm thinking about it. I've been thinking about it, and I will continue to think about it. But I'm an old dog, and it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. So I'm not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Yeah. Paul.
Thank you, Alex. The man who knew, the life and times of Alan Greenspan. Let me start by saying it's an honor to be here with Sebastian and Al to talk about this. This is a really interesting book. There's a huge amount of research that's gone into it. It's well documented. I found it very interesting. Let me tell you my biases before I start. I worked for Alan Greenspan starting about the year after he took over the Federal Reserve, and I worked for him for roughly 10 years. And I will tell you quite up front, he was the best boss I ever had, so I'm a fan. I'm going to point out some issues that I think were problematic, but you should take that with you with my comments. So first of all, let me say some of the most fascinating things in the book I found were the early, how Greenspan got to where he got. Once he was chairman, I was kind of there. I knew a lot of that. When I left the Fed, some of that was pretty interesting afterwards. I didn't see the inside baseball that Sebastian documents in his book, but the early years were really pretty eye-opening to me. I was unfamiliar with how important Alan Greenspan was in so many economic policy decisions. At least he was a player in so many things in modern macroeconomics. So he was one of the original people that did economic forecasting when economic forecasts became critical for business plans and for the federal budget. So if you want to get a federal budget passed, the forecast of where the macroeconomy goes for the next 10 years out is critically important. You have to score things. Greenspan was one of the first people in that business. He lived through and advised people through the oil shock and the raging inflation of the 70s. He saw financial markets firsthand innovate to sidestep the regulation Q interest rate caps, and he predicted problems would develop in the S&L industry. Unbeknownst to me, he spent a fair bit of his behind the scenes trying to convince Ronald Reagan that gold wasn't the best thing that would ever happen for a monetary standard. So he was sort of treating gold bug fever behind the scenes. I was totally unaware of that. He was also trying to tap down Jack Kemp supply side dreams that were easily sold to Ronald Reagan and other folks, and he as an economist and as a pragmatic forecaster didn't believe that tax cuts would generate their own revenue to offset that. So I didn't realize how important he was in that regard before I ever knew him and worked for him. He was a part of the S&L meltdown. I knew about that. I knew he had dealings with the Keating folks and things like that. And he was on the sidelines when the New England banks teetered, but he saw that firsthand. He saw Too Big to Fail when Too Big to Fail was created. He was advising people then. He was called on to reform Social Security and was widely given credit for that achievement, where they had a bipartisan agreement that came out and things seem to have gone okay, and we face that now time and again. He took over the Fed, and shortly after he was there, he faced the '87 market crash, and Sebastian talks in his book how they sort of got through that and how Greenspan got through that. He gives a lot of credit to the New York Fed and Gerald Corrigan, I think, for getting us through there. But here's the beginnings of the legendary Greenspan put. So the market tanks, Greenspan reacts, the Fed reacts. Greenspan at first maybe wasn't all in favor of it. Manuel Johnson he gives him a little credit for creating this whole idea of the put. It was the Manny Johnson put originally, but Greenspan reinforced it a number of times over his career. And then we lived through the regulatory reform. So shortly in 1988, I came on board. And I was a part of the process that helped him fill out the regulatory reforms that came out of the '87 stock market crash, futures markets, margin requirements, all that kind of stuff that came out. But then in the late '80s and early '90s, Greenspan was the chair when we had the creation of things like Section 20 subsidiaries in the banks, where they started underwriting securities in a big way. Nationwide banking, where we had banks combined across state lines and had nationwide banks. Derivatives and structured financial products were really created and became important under Greenspan's tenure. And I would just point out that actually structured finance, the thing that we think was evil, was really created by the government in the aftermath of the S&L crisis. The agency that was created to manage the S&L assets is the one that created the senior subordinated structure and sold it to the public. The name escapes me at the moment. RTC actually created that and marketed that and got investors used to the senior subordinated structure that created the history that allowed subprime to take hold later on. So it was our government actually that started that, and it was in response to the S&L crisis. So we saw the irrational exuberant speech, which is famous in the mid-'90s, and his subsequent retreat from market valuation calls, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit in a minute. He was there for the implosion of Mexico, Southeast Asia, and the LTCM crisis and managed us through that. The repeal of Glass-Steagall, the dot-com bust, and the ultra-low interest rates that followed, and this sort of triggered the issues about his legacy. Did he trigger the subprime crisis? So before I talk about my next slide a little bit, I thought one of the very interesting things was the gossip side of the book. If you ever had the chance to work with Alan Greenspan at any close length, one of the startling things about the book is how he was a social creature. You would never know it. If you worked with him, he was very shy and an introvert and very much a numbers man, but it turns out he's on the party scene all the time with beautiful women on his arm and had all kinds of different girlfriends over time, and this is just a very interesting thing. If you know, even if you see him on TV, you would just never guess that. You would just, but it's true, and his cars and things like that. So I'm going to come, one of my thesis here, you know, was Greenspan the man who knew? Well, he made it his business to know and befriend everybody important in Washington. That's pretty clear from Sebastian's book. He did the social circuits, he had a lot of lunches, he cultivated these relationships, he knew which parties to go to. Did he really know as much about the state of the economy as Sebastian portrays? You know, and here I would take a little bit of an issue, especially when I read the parts I know a lot about, when I live through. It's a little bit to me like watching 60 Minutes. You know, if you ever watch 60 Minutes on a Sunday night, sometimes you see these episodes and they're fascinating. You think you learn so much, but then every once in a while something comes on 60 Minutes that you really know a lot about. And then you see how shallow the reporting really is and how they get the facts wrong, and you kind of go back in your mind and you say, whoa, I bought all those other 60-minute stories, but here when they do something, a story on something I really know about, you know, I'm thinking it's pretty shady. So I love the first part of the book, but when you get to the part I know a lot about, I'm thinking, there's some issues here, but that's not that you could know that. You'd have to, and I think Al would probably agree. That's inside baseball. There's no way you could know these things, and you did a great job. But anyway, when I read the book, my recollection of the time I was there was life at the time was never as clear as the book portrays. People were always dealing with unknowns, and no one, not even Greenspan, knew that a policy would lead to a certain outcome. Nobody knows the best policy. It's much more like quantum mechanics. You do something and 5 different things could happen, and there's some probability, and you don't really know them. But in hindsight, it's easy and I suspect this is what happens in a lot of historical accounts. It's much easier to connect cause and effect with straight lines when you're right there in the heat of things. It looks much more muddled, ex ante, I think, and I think Al was kind of alluding to that a little bit. It's never that clear when you're there. It's always clear 10 or 15 years down the road when you read the minutes and you say, oh yeah, that's why they did it. Well, it's a little harder. So I'm going to tell you a story that I was on there. So Greenspan paid attention to the stock market a lot more than he.
Because this is so good, you're getting 3 extra minutes.
Oh, cool. So when I started in '89, there was a mini crash, and he wanted the people to predict how the Dow would open every day. So I was a guy that would come in at 5:30 and call London and find out how the Dow stocks closed in London, and I would predict how the Dow would open and have to have them on his desk at 7:30. And the first time I did it, he looked at my little Excel chart. He said, "That's not how I want that." I didn't know him as I'm just starting to work. "That's not how I wanted this chart to look." And I said, "Well, no, nobody told me." But anyway, so in 1994, and this is documented in a Wall Street Journal piece in May 8th, 2000. In 1994, he was really getting concerned with the level of the stock market. So he sent a bunch of staff people to build some models and model the stock market. And there was a staff briefing on October 31st, and where I was the staff, and we sort of told them, look, markets look a little out of line compared to the model we built. We built a Campbell-Shiller dividend valuation model, which was kind of in vogue at the time. And shortly after our briefing, which many governors were at, he gives the irrational exuberance speech. Now, did I know he was going to give it? No. Did he show me a copy of the speech? No. Were we shocked? Was I shocked when he did it? Yeah, yes. But I did know he cared about the level of the market because I'd been modeling it for him for quite a while. And when he gave the irrational exuberance speech, one of the things I don't think Sebastian really talks about in his book is the markets tanked and then recovered, and then they kept on growing for 3 or so more years. And the press hammered on Greenspan for trying to make market calls. And the Congress dragged him up there and said, what's the Federal Reserve doing predicting the level of the stock market? That's not your job. Stick to interest rates. So he really got hammered for his irrational exuberance call, where people sort of told him this, people of import, Bunting and other people up on the Hill, this is not your job. Don't do this. And I think he took that to heart. And when markets kept rising, he may have second-guessed himself. I can't get inside his head, but he started the staff on ways to justify the stock price. So we started on studies about the efficiencies of computing and automation and just-in-time inventory. And there was a project to figure out the actual weight of GDP, because if GDP weighed a lot less, you could trade it a lot easier. So the cost of transportation would go down and everybody would have best productivity. So we're all figuring we're FedExing GDP all around now. Instead, it used to go on trains. So, I mean, he changed what he looked at, and the staff really couldn't justify, how the market had grown with productivity. And in August 1999, in your book at Jackson Hole, he kind of documents it and throws in the towel, and he says, there's a lot of smart people that make asset prices, and maybe we shouldn't be second guessing them. And so that's kind of where he comes to this junction where he's not going to call markets anymore. And I think that stuck with him. And I think the sting of the criticism he took between, I don't have any documentation, but that's my opinion being there, that sting sort of made him think twice before he'd want to stir up a hornet's nest calling a bubble. On bank regulation and deregulation, he was your side man. That was never his main interest. He outsourced it to Bill McDonough, the New York Fed, or to the Basel Committee, who was chairman of the Basel Committee, and to other Fed governors. He actually did step in one time. I wrote a paper where when they put the internal markets approach, which is a value at risk approach for banks, a statistical approach to set capital, I wrote a paper about 1995 where I said there's just no way regulators can validate the numbers that come out of this. You'd need millions and millions of days of observations to do it, and you're basing it on 200 days. 200 days. There's no way you know if the bank's telling you the truth. And he kind of liked that. He knew that numbers and models lie. And so Jim O'Brien and I invented something called the pre-commitment approach, where we said, you know what you ought to do? You ought to have banks have models, but you ought to have the chairman of the bank not give you a model number, but tell you, write down on a piece of paper, what is the biggest trading risk loss you could take in the next quarter. He writes it down on paper, and he says he will testify that he will not lose more than that amount, and that becomes the capital number. And if they lose more than that amount, then you should punish them. And he really liked this idea. This was the idea that the banks would discipline themselves. They could do whatever. They could use a Ouija board. We didn't really care, but it was the chairman at the end testifying, the chairman of the institution saying, that's the most we're ever going to lose, and I sign my name to that, and you're going to penalize me, I know. And he really liked that. We had a project with the clearinghouse. We did it for a few months, but he wasn't going to step in the way of the Basel juggernaut that was going forward. That was too much water under the bridge. But he did take an interest in that. But most of the really technical stuff he outsourced. So why don't I, since I'm running over time, why don't I stop there? But Sebastian, I loved your book, and I really do recommend it to you. It's a great historical read. I mean, of really what happened in a lot of our lifetimes.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
All right, at this point, I want to give Sebastian a chance to make any comments or replies that he sees fit. We'll give the author 5 minutes for that, and then the panelists another couple minutes each to carry on. So, Sebastian, your thoughts?
Well, both very good sets of comments. I'd say, so Al put his finger on the big thing, which is it's much easier to have one instrument, the interest rate, and basically one objective. If you have in your mind that in the dual mandate, one part of the mandate is primary. So then you've got one tool, the interest rate, one objective, the inflation rate, and that's immensely seductive, because with one tool and one output, you probably can do the job. And that is indeed what the Fed achieved in the Greenspan era. It created the great moderation in terms of price behavior. And I understand that that's, this is sort of the culmination of a long period of intense monetary economics. And when you get that right, you feel very happy, and you don't want to mess with it by introducing these distractions, whether it's the exchange rate or whether it's asset bubbles. But what if in the real world, asset bubbles actually disrupt stable long-run growth more than overshooting your inflation target by a percentage point or two? I mean, I've had the experience of presenting my view to mixed audiences where there are some central bankers / monetary economists who always say what you say. They always say, well, we got this right. We stabilized inflation. Don't take away our achievement. You're going to mess everything up. And then the other half of the audience is sort of business leaders And they say, yeah, of course. I mean, you have multiple objectives when you run a business. You've got different stakeholders. It's messy. There are trade-offs between. You never deliver perfectly what any one stakeholder wants. And you're juggling because the world is messy. And that's my view of this. I think the world is messy. In an ideal world, it would be delightful if you could have one tool and one target. But unfortunately, we have to worry about asset prices. That's what 2008 proves. We can't just clean up afterwards. I don't think regulation is going to cut it. And therefore, I think we have to be, even though it's messy, we have to be willing to contemplate the use of interest rates. Where to come in on Paul's comments. I actually, listening to you talk about why Greenspan backed off bubbles because he got beaten up after '96, to me that's actually rather consistent with what my account says. I think there was an element psychologically with Greenspan is that he liked to be intellectually honest, and he was, but he also didn't like to confront difficult political fights or even confront people face to face. He was quite devious. He would go around your back and leak something to the press, but he wouldn't shout in your face or fight you directly. And I think this predisposition showed up early on when, when he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. His predecessor had also been the spokesperson for economics in the administration. And he explicitly refused to do that because he didn't want to be out there saying something, enunciating a policy that he didn't himself agree with. So he said to President Ford, I'm not going to do that. I'll give you my honest advice behind the scenes in private. I will be honest with you. And then if you do something totally different because of political constraints, I understand, Mr. President, there are political constraints. I'm not going to feel cut up about that. So that was the way, he's told me this, he's very explicit about that separation he had in his head. And I think when it came to the famous irrational exuberance speech at AEI, part of what was going on actually is that he talked about market overshoot in that speech, but he did it with a question mark on the end in a very elliptical, indirect fashion. And it was almost as though he was being intellectually honest by raising the question, but he was not confronting anybody, least of all Congress, with an actual recommendation that you have to go do something about this bubble. So he raises the issue elliptically, he raises interest rates once, and that's it. And that's not enough. And if you back off, it's not going to do anything. And so then after he felt, well, I've tried, and in fact he was taunted by Larry Lindsay, who was on the board then, who would rather forcefully and repeatedly bring up the danger of bubbles. And he said, well, I've tried it now. I've tried to do something about them. And he felt he was sort of off the hook in that comment. But I think there's a whole bunch of these psychological reasons, the fact that he was beaten up in Congress, the fact that there was an inflation targeting consensus that didn't legitimize going after bubbles, that in combination explain why Greenspan didn't do more about bubbles. So I don't feel as though anything you said contradicts my story there. And I think it just underlines the point that politics and the zeitgeist boxed him up, and his own personality boxed him up, and he didn't do the right thing. The right thing would have been to raise interest rates more aggressively when confronted by a bubble.
Okay, thank you. Al, additional comments? 2, 3 minutes?
I just would make, going back to the fundamental point of whether in conducting monetary policy, the Fed should give explicit weight and be more aggressive in trying to deal with bubbles or financial stability issues in one way or another. And you just made the point, Sebastian, that the world is just not that simple. If I heard you right, you kind of said that's sort of that. Maybe that would work in an ideal environment where it would be feasible and sensible to just have a single focus on price stability. And let me say that your book, you've got me thinking, and so I'm going back to where I come from and seeing how I can defend it. And I think the way I would do it is this. What you just said to me underestimates to some degree the difficulty in whatever world we live in of achieving price stability. And the key operative word here for me is credibility. and this is what much of the research on macroeconomics over a long period of time has grappled with. I go back when I started off, we were talking about cost push inflation, and that kind of thing, and the sorts of things that Burns focused on. So this idea of having to establish credibility to have any chance of having a stable price level, which means a stable monetary system, a stable purchasing power of the currency, requires that you get there somehow. And so when I think about that, and I go back and I think about, the 90s when we were there, maybe you came a little bit later, Paul, but what I remember, you Greenspan, you go into office in 1987. What's the background? You had this awful inflationary period with a hell of a lot of discretionary and idiotic policy to try to deal with it in the 1970s. Then you get into the 80s. So how did we find? Volcker makes the first step. He breaks the inflation psychology and the particular cycle that we were in then, but at a great cost. It wasn't as bad as 08, but it was for that. That was up until then, I think, the worst and deepest recession we'd had since the Depression. So then we begin to, when Greenspan takes office, he's not there yet. He's not really at price stability, and so he's still thinking about how to get there. And I think, in my own mind, that although at times, frankly, it was hard to see that, I and others wanted him to act even more aggressively and more single-mindedly on that in order to achieve this credibility. So I remember in 1994 very well. That was a very important year for the FOMC. That was my first year as a voting member. So my first vote was at February 1994 meeting. And he wanted a quarter of a point, and I didn't dissent at that particular meeting. But I remember as we went through that year, I remember in particular the September meeting, we didn't do anything. We'd moved in, I guess, done a 50-point move in August. But he doesn't want to do anything. He wants to let that sit. Seemed to me and a number of other people that we needed to move more aggressively because of this credibility issue. I'm just trying to give you a picture of how difficult it was at that point to get to that. So, so I dissented at that meeting. And I mean, they did 75 basis points. That would be a huge move now. God knows at the next meeting, okay? So all I'm trying to say is that if you look at it that way, so if we were then fighting the battle of, the Fed is a monetary policy agency, which we can't really control the unemployment rate. We were fighting off those who wanted us to compromise on the price stability goal by focusing more on employment. So now if you move to financial stability, that's the environment in which he was, I think, reluctant to move more aggressively. I don't know that that's a full answer. I think you've made a very valid point, but I do think that that's something that needs to be explored.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Sebastian. Then we'll get Paul.
All of that is very well taken and is an absolutely good invocation of the first half of the 90s. And I think that in the first half of the 90s, the mission for Greenspan, as you say, was to stabilize prices, and the job wasn't done until the mid-90s. Then the issue is you have to pivot. Then a new enemy looms on the horizon, which is a takeoff in leverage in the shadow banks and so forth, and this propensity towards bubbles. And my critique is, that I agree with you, price stability was the priority until the mid-90s, and then a new enemy emerged, and there should have been a new think. And easy for me to say in retrospect as a historian, much harder in real time to get that. But now that we've been through 2008, now it is time that we do get it. That's my point.
Thank you. Let's go to Paul.
So, this is all very interesting. One of the things that I think you could pull out of the book, if you read it, and you don't have to second guess the economics, but what you can see is how much the policymakers' vision of how to control the economy varied over time. It's not like anybody, I mean, to put it frankly, it's not like anybody really knows how to do this, right? They're making it up as they go. There's one way, and then there's Paul Volcker's another way, and everybody, they switch back, and part of it is managing the politics of the situation so they can raise interest rates, but it's not like anybody has that formula. even John Taylor, nobody's got the formula exactly down. We don't really know how the economy works. We don't really know how to get from A to B so clearly. And I think if you actually read through the 60 years of history and the Fed and the Volcker and the Burns, and you kind of look at it from 20,000 feet, you can really see that we changed all over the place all the time. And it wasn't because we really knew what we were doing, right? We kind of make it up as we go. But I want to come back to this other point. And, the interest rates, and the other thing he's famous for, infamous for, as you can see, is, he's a lifeguard of the economy, the financial sector, the Greenspan put, right? So we really think of that. But what we're proposing going forward, this whole idea that the central bank's got to manage bubbles, it's really kind of ironic, right? The criticism of Greenspan's failure to foresee the subprime crisis, it's really ironic because Dodd-Frank's macroprudential regulations require the Fed officials to have the presence of superheroes, really. They have to see where investors are going wrong. What are they over-investing in? And Greenspan couldn't do that himself. One of the smartest men, I think we've all agreed, held the office. And now we're saying we need a bunch of Fed superheroes. So let me just give you, there's Janet Yellen a storm using her powers to control the macro economy. There's the vice chairman flying to our safety. And then we got Turillo down here who's trying to figure out how to use the CCAR to get those banks under control. So, Sebastian, is it really, if Greenspan wasn't smart enough to foresee all this and stop this, maybe the politics held him out. But are these guys going to reach out and keep those banks from growing? And how long? And if we were only at 1% forever, how long are they going to stand up against the political, blowback?
So, Paul, I take your point, of course. Let's just, everyone understands that in real time, decision-making is messy, and there's a lot of unknowns. And in fact, one of the quotes I have at the start of my book, there are 4 quotations before the book even begins, is to the effect of, people out there think we know what we're doing, but we don't really know what we're doing. And this is a Greenspan quote from the Federal Open Market Committee. So I totally understand that, and I do try to reflect some of that, fog of war, uncertainty at some points in my narrative.
But I think it's there. I enjoyed reading that part.
But having said all that, I do want to insist on the point that it's not like the Fed knew nothing about the danger of leverage in the 2000s. If you read the FOMC transcripts, they do talk about it. And I mean, I cite a particular meeting, I think it's in January 2004 or around there, where there's a whole conversation about compressed yields. And Tim Geithner says this is going to be unwound only with some drama. And Roger Ferguson, the vice chairman, says, well, this is looking pretty frothy, but I guess we have a choice. Either we get people back to work by having super low rates, and there was a sense that the economy was still below potential. But if we operate loose policy, we're going to have a bubble. But I'm willing to take the bubble because I want to get people back to work. So the Fed understood that there was brewing financial risk. It didn't know 2008 specifically would happen. Of course not. Nobody knew that. But it did know there was risk. So I think that these superheroes in the picture are able to know when, on a case-shiller basis or on any other basis you want, that the risks are higher. You don't know for sure when it's going to blow up, but you know when the risks are higher. And therefore the question is, what do you do? I think Greenspan was the man who knew. He knew not specifically, but generally, but he didn't act. How do we create an intellectual environment where the future Fed chair will act? And I think it starts in this room by accepting that the use of interest rates sometimes may be a good supplement to the use of regulation.
I think on that point, we're going to let the panel rest for a minute and turn to the audience. We have about 10 minutes. I would say, though, Sebastian, people may have known there was a bubble, but they didn't know how big the bubble was.
Absolutely.
And if they were willing to take a bubble, that proves they had no idea what was really happening along the line of Paul's comments here.
One 5-second comment, and I'll shut up because I'm beating the same horse. But
We're
I remember
you first.
The early '04. That was right before I left. But keep in mind the context again. We had just come off a deflation scare, and that was still there. And that was a big factor And people, we were now worried about credibility to avoid deflation, okay?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that necessarily excuses not doing something, but that's a huge factor in people's thinking.
We're going to call on this gentleman to start. I want to remind you to tell us your name and your affiliation and ask a question. If you get involved in too long a statement, the chair will remind you to come to the question. Yes, sir.
Oh, in that case, I will turn this. No, just kidding. I'm Jaime Marquez from Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I retired from the board in 2013. Paul and I worked together at the Fed and in graduate school. I have to say that I'm not particularly persuaded about the arguments about using the interest rate to address bubbles. There are two arguments. First, you have to know that there's a bubble. Most of the time, these are defined in retrospect. So any rising price assets, it does not mean a bubble. Suppose then that there is an interpretation about the price of the assets rising, and it just turns out that there was no bubble, but following your suggestion, the Fed acted. What would that mean? So that's I think the main argument in my mind against pursuing bubbles, that you don't know where they are in advance. And if you happen to make a mistake, then there are going to be ramifications for income and prices that are hard to justify.
Yes, so that's a question to you, Sebastian.
Look, I think sometimes that point is made in a kind of excessively binary fashion. You know or you don't know. The world isn't like that. It's like Paul describes it. It's messy. There are grays. And sometimes you're worried. You don't know it's a bubble, but you're worried that it might be, or it might be getting there soon. So I have two specific moments in my historical account where I think this was a case. So in 1999, the Fed had just cut interest rates 3 times to respond to long-term capital management. And the real economy was humming along, but there was no inflation because of whatever, technological change, globalization, et cetera. And the Fed said, look, there's no inflation, we don't need to raise rates. And so they left those 3 interest rate cuts, which had been justified with respect to asset prices, by the way, they left them in there for several months. And at the time, did they know there was a bubble? They didn't know specifically for sure 100% there was a bubble, but they could see that the IPOs of things like Priceline.com were completely crazy. I mean, this was high NASDAQ madness. And lots of people were saying, these valuations of the NASDAQ are crazy. And indeed, they turned out to be crazy. Now, what would have been the downside if, observing the NASDAQ, the Fed had tightened by those 3 cuts that it had made in the end of 1988 responding to LT, if it had taken back those cuts in the first quarter of 1999? I don't think there would have been a downside. The economy was fine, employment was full, the real economy could have withstood those interest rate hikes, and you would have taken the froth out of the NASDAQ a year earlier. I just don't see the downside. I mean, of course, no, I take that back. I see that the balance of risks would favor that action. 2004, 2005, it's the same story. The subprime bubble was there. It was debated. The staff came to Greenspan and talked about it. There were, presentations to the FOMC about whether this was a dangerous bubble or it wasn't. The presentations were not conclusive. It was difficult to prove that real estate prices were going to blow up. But, the question was very much in people's conversation. The risk of the yield spreads kind of having come down was there. The so-called conundrum debate was out in the open. People were positing that it was Chinese savings, but positing the cause of the weird behavior of markets merely underlines that people were observing a weird behavior of markets. So I don't buy the argument that it's just binary. You either have to know for sure it's a bubble or you know nothing. No, in the real world, you have probable cause. And I think when you have probable cause and employment is full, not when you're below potential. Sweden did a stupid thing. At one point recently, Sweden was in a sort of lowflation trap, and it raised interest rates to fight a bubble. That's dumb, you can't sustain that. But when you're operating at potential, you have the leeway to use interest rates in response partly to asset prices. I think it's a relevant argument for the next 12 months, by the way. I think we're going to be at full employment. I think real, core inflation will be fairly well behaved. It's below target still now. It's not, it'll take a while to overshoot. But asset prices may well take off. And I think the Fed should pay attention.
Thank you for the question which inspired our speaker. Yes, here. John, wait for the microphone.
John Foley from the Federal Housing Finance Agency. My question relates to data that a future Fed could use, particularly in the real estate context. I mean, one of the things that happened in 2008, and to Alex's point, we didn't know how big the bubble was. Well, we didn't know the extent of leverage. Fannie and Freddie didn't know, the Fed didn't know, no one knew. And one of the things that was happening was, I'm not necessarily talking about the 80-20s with the silent seconds, but I mean, even a properly underwritten loan, arguably, 20% down. Well, value of the house goes up 15%. They get a second, they take out 35%. So suddenly they've got nothing. And then prices fall 15, 20%, and suddenly they're underwater. And we had no way of knowing that they were in fact underwater if that knowledge was out there. Whether the Fed's going to, raise interest rates, regulation, Fed bully pulpit. I mean, how much of a benefit would access to that real-time data have? And incidentally, I just want to end it with, abroad they did have better access to leverage, and it didn't seem to help them. But what would be your reaction?
Thanks, John.
Maybe the others want to.
Anybody? What about better data on how much leverage there really is around in the system? Any thoughts?
I've got a thought, but I'm not sure. It's a little indirect, so give me just trying to work it out. And I want to kind of think, and I think this will get to your question, at least indirectly. I want to think about a situation where, like 1999, where you don't have inflation you got price stability. You don't have inflation or deflation, and maybe you're close to full employment. That doesn't mean there's still an argument, an economic argument for raising rates in a situation like that. And in fact, we argued for that, if I'm not mistaken, in several of the early meetings in 1999. And it comes, I'm kind of thinking of a real business cycle context here, if any of you are familiar with that literature, where rates need, in a stable economy, you may have a stable price level, and you may have labor markets cleared and good growth, but you have some demand demand doesn't necessarily have to be a bubble. That's kind of what I'm trying to say. Just there are forces in the macro economy that justify raising rates. And so to come to when I said that about adding a third term to the Taylor rule, I was only half kidding. If there was some way to capture that, and maybe the kind of data that you have in mind would be something that would do that. I think what would worry me is that if you're in that kind of environment and you say, hey, I think I smell a bubble, and there's and you take some discretionary action, then you run into you go backwards. You have to worry about credibility and what you do there. So if we do something like this, I hope it's not just let's kind of think about popping bubbles. We need to have something more systematic to drive this, or else you're going to get longer run into problems. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to.
Thanks to the audience for getting us very much on the point questions. We're unfortunately out of time, but the panel, all of us will be there at the reception, and all the questions you didn't get to ask, come see the panel. Now, don't go away, because there's a special event coming up. But before the special event, let me thank Sebastian, our author, and our discussants very much for what was a very lively and interesting discussion. And now, are we ready?
Do I do it? So your book, Sebastian, the whole toll of events, starting in the 50s and all the way through, and I don't